Okay, we're 2 minutes past the hour. I think we're ready. What do you think, Drew? I see.
Yeah, I think we're good to go. Sorry.
You can see that I think that was the mute button affecting even the best of us, right?
I mean, working from home these days, I've been managing my mute more effectively, and yeah, I mean, even during a live webinar, I got to manage that mute.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody to this webinar, part of the Vlad and Drew Microsoft Cloud webinar series. And today we're going to do a deep dive into OneDrive Known Folder Move. Let me introduce myself first of all. My name is Vlad Catrinescu, a Microsoft MVP from Montreal, Canada. And today I'm honored to be joined by my co-host, first of all, Drew Madelung. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Absolutely. So my name is Drew Madelung, also a Microsoft MVP, and kind of excited to talk about this topic because I also do concentrate a lot in the OneDrive space. But overall, I'm a consultant helping the customers really also roll out OneDrive, but roll out Office 365 in general.
Awesome. And today we also have a special guest directly from Microsoft, Gaia Carini. How are you doing, Gaia?
Hi, everyone. I'm doing great. I'm super excited to be here and talk about OneDrive Sync and the known folder move. And just a quick intro about myself. I'm lead the PM team, the program management team for the OneDrive Sync client. So my team drives all of the features and functionality around OneDrive Sync on both Windows and Mac OS.
Awesome. Thank you very much. And before we get started, I'll do some of the bit boring housekeeping stuff, but that must be done. So this webinar will be recorded and we will share the recording after. So if you ever want to share it with your colleagues or you want to get back to it after, it will be sent to you in between 24 or 36 hours, as well as the slides. And lastly, at the bottom of your screen, you will see a Q&A tab. Please ask questions. You don't get every day somebody from Microsoft, especially somebody amazing like Gaia that can answer your questions. So if you have any questions, please don't miss this chance to ask them, and we'll get to all of them during the webinar. So that was it for the boring part. Now let's get to the fun part. And Drew, maybe you want to take it over.
Absolutely. So I want to kind of queue up a little bit around this topic and then transfer over a little bit to Guy here to go a little bit deeper. But this is one that myself working with a lot of different customers across the globe, we feel was worthy of diving more into. This is one, OneDrive Known Folder Move is something that's been out for a little bit of time now, and as someone who is helping people roll out OneDrive, I'm starting to see the adoption of this grow. And I think it's one of the things that if you're an organization and you have not yet looked at it, it's something that you absolutely need to. And what was unique about Known Folder Move, which we'll go a ton more into, is it can be complex and there is some more planning to think about when then just kind of turning it on. And there's also some really good things that are coming that have rolled out with it to really help you get started on your journey within with really getting ready for Known Folder Move. So for me, I think this is a one that if you haven't seen it, I think if you haven't seen it at all, you're going to be in for a treat to kind of see what's how helpful it can be. And if you're looking at deploying it or already have, hopefully we'll talk a little bit. We'll be going through a little bit more of the scenarios and nuances that you're going to see when kind of trying to get to your ideal sync state, which is what we really try to think of. OneDrive has a lot of stuff behind this, a lot of features and functionality, and this is just one of them when you're looking at your deployment for OneDrive that needs to be planned out a little bit more than some of the other features that you might be looking at, because it will have impact kind of across the board. I mean, Vlad, in your experiences, I'm sure you kind of have this set up in your environment, and I know Guy, of course, you do too. So I'm gonna stop sharing and transfer over to you, but Vlad, what are your kind of thoughts as far as you actively using Known Folder Move today?
So for me personally, I love it and it's super easy. The thing is, it's super easy to set up and gives me a lot more confidence in kind of where I put the files on my computer, knowing that everything is backed up in a single location. But if we take it at the enterprise level, I think that like you said, people are going to be in for a treat. I think one of the most amazing thing is how complex the systems were before that used to actually manage this, and now it became so easy to do the same task as before and kind of built in. You don't need to take care of so many things anymore. It just works, and you only need to do only a few settings.
Yeah, and sorry, guy. One of the quick story which I love to kind of tell around this is about how it's kind of saved me a little bit too. Uh, I was with a customer and it was kind of right when OneDrive Known Folder Move had rolled out, and I think it was still part of the preview, and I had it on my device, and someone actually, it was a Surface Pro, and a customer dumped an entire cup of coffee all over my Surface Pro.
Oh, wow.
And it was quite exciting for those few minutes. And I actually remember I snapped off the Surface Pro top, thinking everything was good, plugged it back in or snapped it back in on the top. And all of a sudden things started I started to describe, the screen started like flickering. And then it just turned off. And I was like, oh, that's not good. It started smelling. So I was like, I need to go get a different machine. Logged into the new machine. Since I had literally turned on Known Folder Move like within that week, I lost nothing. Like I just opened up, logged in, synced my OneDrive using files on demand and Known Folder Move. I had everything that I was working on like that day. So my documents, my desktop and stuff like that. It was just a very easy scenario that I like to cue this up with, is how it can affect you very, very quickly and without you really knowing. And if you don't have kind of a good backup solution or storage solution for your personal files, whether it's yourself or the enterprise, something like Known Folder Move is very, very helpful for kind of those scenarios like that.
Yeah, I love hearing those stories. And I feel like we hear a lot of those. Also, some stories around, you have some important file in your documents folder and then you're out and you, for example, you realize you really need it and you can just access it from the OneDrive mobile app. So there's so many cool advantages of Known Folder Move, which I'm really excited to get into.
Before you start, Gaia, just one small thing, and I'll make a bit
awesome.
fun
Should
of
we jump in?
Oh, sorry, no, I was going to say, before that, PC folder backup and Known Folder Move. I think me and Drew learned something over the past few weeks, as I think some of you that registered for the webinar before, we actually mentioned both Known Folder Move and PC folder backup. But I think the naming convention, me and Drew got it wrong. And it's something that, like I said, we all make mistakes. Maybe you can cover a bit of that, how Known Folder Move is enterprise and PC folder backup is the same thing, but for consumer, right?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And actually, you guys didn't mess it up. It's more that we've realized that we've had to iterate based on feedback from a lot of customers, like everyone on this call and folks we talk to every day. But basically, we internally started calling the feature Known Folder Move. But in terms of something, we talked to a lot of different end users, and for consumers, really personal users, PC folder, the term backup really resonated with people. And so that's why we decided to go with the terminology PC folder backup. Then we kind of, as part of, this big conference, Microsoft does Ignite, last year we started talking about PC folder backup also in the context of enterprise. And what we realized is backup has a different type of meaning, especially within the enterprise. And while we do back up those folders, it's not a full backup solution because we're not, backing up your whole profile and all the settings. And so based on feedback, we realized that, and a lot of admins we've been talking to and customers had already picked up on the term Known Folder Move and KFM. And so we decided actually, rather than switching to the term PC folder backup in the context of, enterprise organizations, we should just stick with Known Folder Move. So it's kind of been a more recent evolution of the naming, but that's a little bit of the backstory.
That's super helpful to know. And I think it's good. I like hearing that, listening to kind of some of that feedback. I know when I did see some of the names kind of come through, the clarity on it and then the inside name of it, I think is, I like the choice.
Yeah, awesome. Perfect. Should we get started?
Absolutely, let's roll.
Get started, yeah.
Awesome. Thanks so much for having me today. I'm really excited to talk through Known Folder Move, and then we'll briefly touch on also what Drew mentioned earlier, the sync ideal state. But first, I like to start with like OneDrive deployment all up, and then really show where sync and KFM fits into the picture. But if you think about OneDrive deployment overall, it really starts with planning and then usually migrating data, whether it's from on-prem or file shares, through a cloud data migration. So directly from that location to OneDrive and SharePoint in the cloud. And then it's really when you want to start thinking about sync and KFM. And so deploying sync is really about making sure it's installed and then all the different settings that you want to make sure are deployed. And we'll talk a little bit about some of those. And then KFM is really about local data migration. Because there's a bunch of data that's already on the user's machine in these known folders, so desktop, documents, and pictures. And so KFM allows you to move that data to the cloud and make sure it's protected, just like we were talking about earlier. And then obviously, once the user's data is in OneDrive, that's when really driving user engagement and really operationalizing and kind of driving more of the steady state and driving engagement comes into play. And it's kind of a cycle there at the end.
Yeah, and God, I want to touch a little bit on this one because I really like this concept. And when I talk with customers and the people that are on this that are listening, like make sure when you're looking at your planning for OneDrive, the work that you're going to be looking at with KFM, make sure you plan for your KFM up on that front right at the beginning. So because what you don't want to have happen is you get to like you plan your migration and you deploy the sync client, and then you're kind of at a stopping point to say, can we even do KFM today? Or like, are we at a point where is any of our existing infrastructure or network capacity, anything kind of ready for it? Have the plan ready for your KFM enablement at the beginning, so you can be prepared that you don't have a long gap in between deploying the sync client and then allowing and enabling your users with something like KFM.
Yeah, so, that's a great point.
Have the planning for me, have the planning up front for KFM and being aware of it, like from content like this, to know how you can be ready for that when time comes.
Yep, definitely. Yeah, and so really OneDrive Sync and KFM comes into play in those two stages, and that's where we really started talking about this concept called the sync ideal state, which is basically the set of recommendations we have, including KFM, of how we recommend most companies or organizations should deploy OneDrive to their users. But before we jump into that, just a quick reminder, in case you're newer to the sync client, in terms of how to actually make sure it's installed. So in this case on Windows, it actually comes with Windows 10. It's installed whenever a new user profile is set up with Windows 10. It also is installed automatically for the current user with Office. And it also gets installed with Office on Mac OS. Or you can download the installer from our website, and you can deploy that through tools like SCCM or Intune or Autopilot. So you have, yeah.
Are there any restrictions as far as different sync clients or the way they get it for having KFM be enabled?
No, there isn't. So KFM is supported on all OS versions on Windows, so even on Windows 7. And it's supported whether you have the per user install, so that's what comes with currently Windows and Office. Or we also have a per machine install that just installs it once for the whole machine, regardless of how many user profiles, and it's supported there as well. Awesome. And then in terms of actually deploying it, we'll get into the actual group policy settings in a little bit, but for all OneDrive Sync settings, we have an ADMX and ADML file that we publish as part of our builds. So you can find that actually when the sync client gets installed. So you can deploy those through AD and group policy. You can deploy things like KFM through SCCM. And also last year, we also made all of our policies available directly in Intune as part of the administrative templates. So you don't have to, in the past, we had people that needed to, take the ADMX file, ingest that, but now they're just surfaced directly in the Intune portal, which I know can be really helpful for some customers.
And where that comes into play a lot around when you're kind of looking at your planning for KFM, right, is you can, as an administrator, help deploy this. Right? You can, there's KFM settings inside of different deployment options that you can kind of look at and plan to say when and how and who really can start to interact with KFM. So start to have that known folder known folder move available on their workstations, regardless of where
Exactly.
they're at. And there's, for you, I think you've got highlighted, there's different ways depending on your deployment options that you
Yep.
have, or depending on what you're doing, to take those KFM settings and bring them down to those devices.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And we'll get into those settings in a second. Now, we talked a little bit about, this concept of the ideal state. And really, as I mentioned, we've evolved a set of best practices based on working with a lot of different organizations in terms of what we think provides the best user experience with the sync client, and also just provides the best experience managing users. And so there's a lot of different settings here. I won't go into depth into all of them, but Known Folder Move is one of the key ones that you can see on the far right, and that's what we'll focus on today. But just really quickly as a kind of summary of this. So first, you really want to think about making sure auto updates, which are on by default, are working correctly. And also we recommend staying in the production ring, which is the default for most users, and then having some users, for example, within the IT department, maybe on the insiders ring. And so we have a set of URLs to make sure that are working, to ensure auto updates are working. And it's not just the auto updates, but also any new features are enabled through those same URLs. So that's super, super important. And then, as I mentioned, kind of thinking about which users you can maybe put in the insiders ring to get some of the functionality earlier. Windows notification service, that's kind of how the SharePoint Online or OneDrive service tells us that there's changes in the cloud that the sync client needs to sync. It's kind of like a silent shoulder tap. Hey, there's some changes that you need to know about. And so just making sure you allow traffic to this URL is super important as well. Files on demand is a feature that basically allows you to see all of your OneDrive files without not necessarily taking up disk space on the machine. And that's supported both on Mac and Windows. And I'll show it a little bit in my demo later, but it can be really powerful overall. And also if you kind of combine that with Known Folder Move, it's really powerful as well. Office integration is another setting that's on by default, but basically you want to make sure that you don't disable it, because this is really what allows a lot of the rich functionality within the Office desktop clients, like sharing, co-authoring, autosave. All of those features are only enabled on synced files if this setting is enabled. And so that's also super important really to drive that engagement and collaboration within OneDrive. And then the last two are kind of go in some ways hand in hand. Silent account configuration basically allows you to automatically sign users in without them having to remember to click on the cloud icon, enter their credentials, and then sign in. And so if it's supported within your environment, that's something we definitely encourage you to do, so that OneDrive is just set up. And then of course we get to Known Folder Move, which is where we'll spend the rest of this time on. And so let's jump into KFM. So first of all, what is KFM? Because we've talked about it a lot. We talked about some stories. But really what KFM is allows you to automatically move your desktop, documents, and pictures folders on Windows into OneDrive. And so here's a quick screenshot of that. So here I'm in File Explorer, you can see I have my desktop, documents, pictures, folders here available from Quick Access, but you'll also notice that they're showing up in my OneDrive node down here. And if I look in here, if I click on Quick Access, I notice these icons, which if you're familiar with the sync client, you'll know those are the icons we use to show whether a file is in sync or whether it's just, it's not actually on the machine, but it's in the cloud. And so this is super powerful because we know a lot of users are just used to saving files on their desktop, documents, and pictures folders. And so here they don't even have to think about, I need to go to my OneDrive folder and save a file there. They're just saving where they're used to saving their files. And so that takes me kind of to why is KFM so important? And so first of all, like I mentioned, it allows users to really continue saving files to the folders they're familiar with. For example, we all save folders. I mean, I definitely save a lot of my most important folders to my desktop just because it's really easy for me to get back to them. And so then the advantage is that then those files are protected in the cloud. The other one I mentioned earlier, it's awesome when you can then access those folders from anywhere. So for example, if I'm just like walking around and I realize I need this important folder on my file on my desktop, I can just open the mobile app and access it directly there. And then what we've seen, and we'll get to that in the next slide, is it really drives engagement and really good engagement with OneDrive because users can really easily interact with all those files. And here are just another screenshots. So again, here on the left, I have my documents folder. You can see all of those files that I had in my documents folders have little green check marks, which means they're in OneDrive. And then if I right click on any of them, for example, I can share a file directly from File Explorer, which I do all the time when I need to send someone a link. Or I can, open it on the website, or I can even free up space. It's the last option down here. If I really don't need, let's say I have this big PowerPoint deck that I don't really need on my machine, and I like to keep it there on my desktop in case I do, but then I don't actually want it to take up space, and so I can just free up space from there. So that's super powerful. And then anywhere access, again, I can go to the mobile app, or in this case, the website, and I can just go to my documents folder, and I'll see those same exact files that I can saved in File Explorer in the browser.
And Gaia, I think what I've seen in working with customers on this a lot is the familiarity that users have. Right?
Mm-hmm.
We know OneDrive from a product standpoint, you can see it, or from a capability standpoint, the browser and everything is great, but you still have such a ingrained set for using File Explorer and just working on documents, their documents in desktop folder. I can't tell you the amount of times I've talked with people and or someone just shares their screen and you see their desktop and it's completely filled with documents. And you're just like, oh man. I mean, it happens frequently, but it's a process of change that is really hard for someone to move off of, right? I'm not gonna,
Mm-hmm.
It's very hard to tell someone, hey, stop storing everything in your desktop, move it over here. I mean, it's easier said than done.
Yep.
And where I've seen a really good hit with KFM is that they don't have to do that. You don't have to retrain your users on accessing information. Or if you're an IT department, you're looking at what are your processes for backing up users' files all the time? Like for, whether it's for compliance, whether it's for when user gets new machines, like what's your imaging process? It's hard to a lot of people would have to go in, access that information on their local workstation, copy that onto another device and move it over, right? Or copy it and move it over. It is a tedious process. So the ability for KFM to provide users the same experience they have today,
Mm-hmm.
but then enhance their experience by having it available, protected in the cloud. I think what I've seen a huge hit in is having things like DLP and the security controls you have once they're in the cloud to identify and scan and classify that information, even for the stuff that's on their desktop. So it takes it even a step further, but the users still interacting with things the exact same way they are today.
Yeah, exactly. Or even things like, point-in-time recovery. So for example, let's say my machine gets hit by ransomware and now I can't access all those files. Because they're in OneDrive, you can kind of restore them back to the previous state and then they're all safe. Whereas if they weren't in OneDrive, then you wouldn't be able to do that. So.
And do you want to highlight a little bit about the last part of KFM, the move part, and how that is kind of different? So a lot of people have like redirection today, or they're saying, well, I already have my documents stored somewhere else, right? They're stored on a network share or something. What does the move part of KFM really do?
That's a great question. So the move part is basically when you enable KFM, and users can do that, or you can do it through policy settings, and we'll talk about that later. What we'll actually do is repoint Windows to the new location. So Windows has a functionality to tell the OS where those known folders are located. But what we also do is actually move all that content that was in the original location. And so that's the main advantage with if you just do redirection, because then you need to take care of actually moving all the files. Versus move, we actually move them into OneDrive as part of that. And then we tell Windows so that whenever you access all of the applications that use the standard way to access desktop documents, pictures, or like through Explorer, would point directly to the new location in OneDrive rather than the old location.
Absolutely. So to kind of say that, I reiterate that because I think it's a big point I see is if you don't have KFM enabled today, or if you're kind of at the beginning of this process and people already have documents, when you enable KFM, it will sync that information for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you're doing if users have their information on their desktop or their documents today, and then you enabled redirection, you'd have to have a process to get those files into wherever those are being redirected as part of that redirection process, as part of whatever your steps into that cutover would be. So as an administrator, it's much easier to enable something like this, and it gives you more functionality than doing a redirection to a network share.
Yeah, definitely.
Great.
Awesome. Thanks so much for highlighting that. And next I wanted to, the last point here, increase engagement with OneDrive. We've actually been doing a bunch of analysis, and I wanted to share some like quick stats that I think are really powerful and really showing that. So here, based on our analysis, what we're seeing in, in organizations that are enabling KFM, which we've seen a huge growth of, we're seeing a lot more reads, writes, and shares from OneDrive. And so it's really, really driving that engagement with OneDrive. And it's not only reads and writes, which you kind of would expect because now all those files are in OneDrive. And so, you're editing them or you're creating new files or viewing them, but it's also sharing, which is really driving that collaboration, which is a core, value of having all those files in OneDrive and SharePoint. And so people are kind of discovering if you right click on a file, you can share, and it's the same sharing dialogue that we show in Office and on the website, on a mobile, and it's coherent. And so that's kind of some of the stats that we're seeing just from the past year or so of really a lot of organizations adopting KFM.
Hey, Gaia, I have a quick question from the chat here. As
Sure.
we talk about different types of organization, is KFM available into GCC and the different flavors of it as well, or is it public cloud only?
Yeah, that's a great question. Yeah, KFM is purely controlled on the client side. And so it's just controlled through group policy. And so yes, it's available in any environment.
Okay, so even GCC
Yep.
high, DoD,
Yes.
all of the, okay.
Yeah.
Awesome, thank you very much.
As long as you can sync, as long as sync is working, which it does work in those environments, then it would work.
Awesome, thank you.
Yeah, no worries. Okay, so now a little bit about, we've talked about what KFM is, now a little bit about how you would actually deploy it as an administrator. So there's two main policies to think about here, and I'll walk through each one separately. First, there's one that we call the prompt GPO, and it's called prompt users to move Windows known folders to OneDrive. And so what this setting does is when you enable it, your users will see this wizard, which says your IT department wants you to back up your important folders. And it has all of those folders, assuming there's no, it has all those folders selected, and you can then click Start Backup and as a user, and then that will just start the process for you. And so, for example, within Microsoft, earlier last year, as part of, we are deploying KFM within the organization, and so we started with deploying this one to allow users to opt in first. And then the second policy, which I know is pretty popular, especially, and we'll talk a little bit about the recommendations for new devices versus existing devices, but the other main policy is the silent group policy, which basically does this silently without users having to opt in themselves. And so, and then with that policy, you have the ability to specify if you want this little toast, your IT department backed up your folders to show up once the redirection is done and the move is done, or if you just want nothing to show up basically. And we recommend having that because it really kind of drives awareness to end users. So at least even if it's done silently, they're aware of what's going on. But you have the ability to specify that within the group policy setting. And the other thing I'll note is if you enable both of these together, then we will try to do the silent move. And if for some reason it fails, for example, in the past, if you might have tried this last year, you might know that with OneNote notebooks, we weren't able to do the known folder and users would see an error. If you enable both policies at the same time, if we can't do the silent KFM, that's when we'll then show this prompt to users so they can understand what the error is and hopefully either unselect that folder or try to resolve that error before continuing. And actually, before I go into this, so for new devices, our recommendation is to deploy the silent policy from the start, because a new device, there's no data, you start it fresh with all the known folders in OneDrive, and then the files start kind of getting uploaded over time, and there's less considerations around a giant spike in uploads. And so our recommendation for new devices, whether it's like a PC refresh or a new employee, have the silent move enabled and also the silent account configuration policy that I mentioned earlier as part of the ideal state. That way they're just signed into OneDrive, they have their folders protected, and they're good to go. With existing devices, that's where I think a lot of the planning is more important. And so we think about that in 3 different stages. First is really preparing and thinking about how much data is there, where it's located, how you're gonna roll it out. And we have this script, which you'll notice still has the PC folder backup name, so I need to fix that. But we do have a PowerShell script that helps you understand, if it's helpful, how many items are in each known folder and how many bytes basically those take up. So that's kind of one thing to take a look at. But the main thing is really deploy gradually. And that's really important because on existing devices, users can have gigs and gigs of data, especially if they've been at the company or the organization for a long time. And so deploying gradually is super important to avoid a giant spike on your network and also on the backend service that can then cause delays in other parts of the OneDrive and SharePoint experiences. And so our guidelines here, you can see, if you're doing the prompt GPO, because there's a drop-off, not everyone will opt in. We recommend not going over 5,000 devices per day. With the silent one, we recommend a smaller limit, just to really, and even beyond this limit, starting with an even smaller batch, like maybe starting with 10 users and then maybe 100, just to understand kind of the impact to the network and to the environment before going broader. But we don't recommend, for example, deploying the silent move to 30,000 devices all at once, because that can definitely cause issues. And it's something that we're really thinking about how we improve on, but that's kind of the current recommendation. And then finally, really monitoring progress. And that's where in a little bit later, I'll talk about the roadmap, but here, the team is really hard at work to really build a set of reporting. I showed a really, really early preview of kind of a CSV version of this at Ignite last year during our talk, but the team is really hard at work at really providing self-service reporting that administrators can use to really monitor the rollout, understand if there's errors and if KFM is completed. Awesome, and now let me jump into a demo.
Before we go into the demo, let's just take 2 quick questions. So first of all, do users need to have a Microsoft account or be on Azure AD before configuring KFM?
They don't need to be on Azure AD. In terms of Microsoft account, does it mean a Microsoft 365 account?
So the way that I understand it, maybe Drew, you can jump in, Microsoft account is personal and Azure AD account would be kind of your Microsoft 365 account, which is the enterprise one.
Yeah, so it's supported on both. You can either, you can enable it as an end user, with your personal account, or as an administrator or as an end user, you can enable it with your organization account.
Okay, so I think Michael is, if on the enterprise side for OneDrive for Business, they need to be synced with Azure AD, and they need to, of course, have their OneDrive for Business provisioned. So this has somewhere to go to get saved. And for personal, it's just a Microsoft account and personal OneDrive.
And Azure AD is actually not required. That's more for the silent account config.
Okay. And the second question from Edwin, where do you run that PowerShell script? Is it on the local computer?
Yeah, so this script here I was talking about prepare. Yeah, it's basically you have to run it on the local machine in the context of the user's profile. What we're really building towards is something that allows you to look at all machines together, and that's what I mentioned in the monitor progress. But yeah, that's
awesome. Thank you. That's it for the questions for now. Just wanted to get to them before the demo.
Yeah, totally. Awesome. So let me go here. So first I wanted to just briefly show you those 2 policies I mentioned. So here I'm in the Intune portal, and I have a device configuration profile I've set up for the sync ideal state. Here, for example, I can see this is one of the policies I mentioned. prompt users to move Windows known folders to OneDrive. So when you click enabled, all you need is a tenant ID, and then that's all you need basically to have it enabled. And that'll get picked up when the sync client restarts. We pick up policy setting changes. And so that's kind of the one, if you want to show that wizard experience. If instead you want to do the move silently, you can go to this, I'm going to just click back to here. You can go here to silently move Windows known folders to OneDrive. And if you click enabled, again, you need the tenant ID. And then here you see that little toast notification that I showed on the slide earlier. You can specify whether or not you want users to see that right here. So that's kind of a little bit about those two policies, but let me actually show you the enabling the feature. And I'm gonna actually show you that to you as an end user, just for the purpose of the demo. So here I'm on my desktop. I have a bunch of important docs that I've been working on for work here on my desktop. If I go to File Explorer, you can see that I have other bunch of PowerPoint decks and spreadsheets and stuff here in my Documents folder. But they're really here on this PC. I don't see any status because they're not in OneDrive here. So what I'm gonna do is, and let me show you also, if I right click, I don't get any of the features I mentioned earlier where you can share a file because obviously it's not in OneDrive. So what I'm going to go here is go into the settings for my OneDrive account here at Contoso Electronics. And I'm going to go to this backup tab. And I'm going to say manage backup. And then you can see here I get this this similar wizard, but in this case, I'm enabling it manually, so it doesn't tell me my IT administrator is trying to do this. It's just me wanting to do this. And it pre-selects all 3 known folders. It tells me each one is about a megabyte or 2. And I'm going to click Start Backup. And actually, before I do that, I want to show you one more thing that I forgot. So here in my Documents folder, before I do this, I'm going to copy over. I have this OneNote notebook that's pretty important, and so I'm going to copy it in here into my Documents folder. So if I open the notebook, it's this local notebook that I've been using to take a bunch of notes. And as I mentioned earlier, if you tried KFM last year, you'll know that that was a key blocker for the known folder move to happen. So let me go here back to Manage Backup. And you can see here, it's saying that I can go ahead with the known folder move, even though I have that OneNote notebook in there. I'm going to click Start Backup. Now it's going to start, it will detect all the files, redirect the folders, and upload them to OneDrive. So for example, if I go up here, you'll see that it starts to upload all those files. It's telling me OneDrive is starting to back up your files. I'm going to close this. And before I jump in to show you File Explorer, I want to show here in the Activity Center on the bottom right, you'll see that this notebook that I showed you was uploaded, and then you'll see that that was removed a few seconds later. And the reason that happens, if I go back to Documents, is because the notebook that I had in there was what's called a local notebook. It's kind of an older version that's just meant to be on your local PC, but it's not really the type of notebook that the OneNote client syncs when it's in OneDrive and SharePoint. And so the functionality we built last year, which is now fully rolled out across all rings, is basically to do a conversion of that notebook to a cloud notebook that the OneNote client can sync, and then replace that with this shortcut that points to that notebook in the cloud. And so if I then go back to OneNote, you will see that that Work Notes notebook that was local is now, you will see this syncing icon within OneNote. And so OneNote automatically picked up the fact that that notebook was moved into OneDrive, and you didn't have to close or reopen that notebook. It was just automatically done for you. So that's something awesome. That's really exciting, and I know a lot of customers were waiting for in order to deploy known folder move, because a lot of people have those. If
you didn't have it, it was pretty tough to try to deal with the user change for it, because a lot of people had their OneNote notebook. So that's definitely it will be a very nice thing. It is a very nice thing, I should say, to have.
Yeah, totally. We're really excited. The other thing you'll notice, like here, they're a little bit small, but you'll see icons on my files on my desktop. So now, for example, if I wanted to share this PowerPoint, I can do that here, click share, and that'll just allow me to immediately copy a link and send that to my coworker here. And that makes it super easy to just collaborate on those files. Also, for example, if I wanted to, I have this, let's say this PowerPoint that I really don't want to be on this device, I can just click up, free up space. And what that'll do is you'll notice that the icon here, it's a little bit small, turn into a cloud icon. That means the file is still in OneDrive, but it's not taking up any disk space on my machine. And so that can be really powerful as well. And then of course, if I go to the website, I'm gonna refresh here the OneDrive page. You'll see now that these 3 new folders appear: desktop, documents, and pictures. And if I go into desktop, for example, all of those files are there. And the same thing would happen if I were to access from the mobile device. So that's a little bit about how KFM actually works. So you can enable it as an end user today. If you don't have it enabled, I definitely recommend going to do that. And you can check out the group policy settings to deploy it within your environment.
And Gaia, showing that sync agent, there's a good question out there. So let's say we turn that on for a lot of different people. Is there a way to monitor that sync agent? So we know we have so right now you have the PowerShell script, and that would be the option we have right now to show. Do you want to speak a little bit around that? Yeah,
sure. So basically, here we have this PowerShell script that you can find in GitHub at this URL down here. And that tells you whether or not the redirection happened. You do need to run it on every machine. And it doesn't necessarily tell you that the sync line is in sync, but it does tell you that the redirection happened. And that it succeeded. But really what we're working towards is a way to aggregate that information and consume that kind of across the organization. And we know that'll be super helpful as part of deploying KFM. But definitely you can check out this script in the meantime, because that's available today.
Awesome, thank you. And I want to add one more thing on the deploy gradually from what we've seen is that, especially at a time to now when a lot of people are kind of working from home, and remote work, and we know is going to continue to be is a thing, and highlighting again what you said, Gaia, that this will move your content, right? It will bring content and sync content up through your network. So when you're looking at deployment of KFM, make sure you think about what the network impact could be if you do silently turn it on. So let's say if you had 500 users and then they were at home and then you turned on KFM, like make sure you understand what the impact for that could be and deploy that in a way that you can understand it, right? So you can say I always try to push for doing pilot pushes with this, so you can really see what that experience will be, especially if you're migrating from an existing redirection state, that you understand what the network impact could be. And another thing that's been kind of nice when you're looking at this is you can also temporarily enable or add some of the policies for bandwidth management for this. So you can kind of combine some functionality, like I want to ensure only a certain percentage of bandwidth is used while we're deploying KFM. So to try to limit some of that bandwidth hit, and then flip that back on or flip that back off once you've kind of fully deployed it, and let the OneDrive sync tool manage its bandwidth the rest of the time.
Yeah, totally. That's a great point. Awesome. So just to recap, I showed you the KFM settings that are available in Intune, as well as through our IDMX file that's published through the build. And then also just doing KFM, including the OneNote migration, which is a feature that we recently shipped and is fully out in all rings, including the enterprise ring as of a few weeks ago. And this is just a quick recap. Really the feature allows you to automatically move your desktop documents and pictures folders. And really the reason it's important is that users can continue interacting with all those folders they're familiar with and get all the benefits of OneDrive and SharePoint with those. And then in terms of actions, as I mentioned, on new devices, we encourage you to enable the silent policy from the start. And then from existing devices, that's where the additional planning is super helpful. deploying gradually. And then as Drew mentioned, you can also potentially take a look at enabling, just for that duration of time, the bandwidth settings to kind of make sure it doesn't overwhelm the network. And then you can find more details about known folder move at this ak.ms link. Next, I just wanted to quickly go over, this is a roadmap slide that we have for OneDrive Sync. I've bolded some of the things that I thought were relevant, in particular for KFM, so I'll go through those really quickly. In terms of delivered since last year, we talked about the OneNote migration, which is the second one here. Another feature that we heard a lot about and that we finished shipping as well is what we call cross-volume sync in KFM. And what that means is there were a bunch of customers that had their user's known folder on a different drive or on, let's say, a network share, while OneDrive was on the main, let's say, C drive. And so before, we prevented KFM in those scenarios. And as of late last year, we actually enabled that scenario, and it's fully rolled out as well. And so that's another big, what we call a legibility blocker, that and OneNote that we really focused on as a team, because we were hearing that from customer feedback and seeing that from the data from the sync client as well. Administrative templates, I showed those, but that just makes it easier for anyone who's using Intune to manage machines to deploy all of our policies, including KFM. And then further down below, I bolded to the files auto rename experience and then the new errors experience. So if there are files that are moving into OneDrive as part of KFM and they have, for some reason, a file name or a folder name that's not supported, we've improved the errors experience to make it more modern, and also enabled a feature that prompts users to help them auto rename those folders and files with one click rather than having to rename all individually. And so that can help if there are some of those errors. And then the last one I bolded down here is something we also recently shipped, which is the new group policy, and it's an upload bandwidth management policy, and it uses functionality in Windows 10 called LEDBAT to basically, it's not a percentage-based one similar to the existing one we have for uploads, but it's basically uses that functionality to know how heavily the network is being used and then adjust dynamically based on that. And so that could be another one to take a look at, in particular if there are a lot of uploads happening like during KFM. In terms of available soon, differential sync, once KFM is done, now all these files that the user is likely interacting with and editing frequently are in OneDrive. Differential sync is what basically allows us to only sync the changes of the files versus the whole file. And so especially with larger files, let's say like an AutoCAD file or a Photoshop file or something, making sure that we only sync the difference is really helpful to just save on network bandwidth and just make it faster. And so that's just something that helps the overall sync experience, but also with KFM. And then increasing the file upload limit from 15 gigs up to 100, that's something that's been rolling out and is continuing to roll out, but that also allows more uploads to happen if there are those larger files. And the last one I highlighted that's coming soon is version history. You might have noticed it in one of my earlier screenshots in the context menu. But basically, that's just another example, just like share, where you'll be able to kind of access some of that awesome functionality from OneDrive and SharePoint directly from File Explorer, including, let's say, accessing the version history of PowerPoint on your desktop, for example. And so that's just another one that can be one of those really cool features to interact with those files. And then in terms of top of mind, sync reporting is something that we're working on and I know is top of mind for a lot of customers that I talk to on a weekly basis, both in terms of just that steady state of having OneDrive sync, but also in terms of KFM. And then another one that I've heard a lot about based on feedback that we're also working on is a group policy to allow you to ignore certain files and folders. In particular, I've heard a lot about, there's shortcut files or there's PST files, and rather than blocking them where that shows an error, just having the sync client ignore them. And so that's something that we're looking at as well, which I think will be helpful along with KFM.
That's actually one of the questions we just had about,
awesome.
the shortcut.
Yeah.
Oh, great. I answered it already.
So,
Yeah, so basically the idea is, yeah, for any new file, you will be able to set up rules within a group policy to ignore. We're starting with files first based on extension or name, and then expanding that to folders.
And just kind of talk a little bit about that one, because you do see that. So yes, what happens when you sync your desktop, that it will have shortcuts to different things, and you could log onto another machine that might not have information around that. Especially when you're working in larger environments, you see that. So right now, you have to kind of talk with the users or let them know what this is from an adoption standpoint and awareness standpoint. But as of this point, there's not a way to theoretically or to stop specific shortcuts from being synced.
Yeah, exactly. And then, yeah, my last slide is just a recap, kind of reiterating this sync ideal state. So KFM is definitely a super important one and is one of a lot of these are just enabled by default, but really KFM is the one that is super critical, but also requires a lot more thoughtful planning. But it is part of this kind of whole configuration, set of recommended configurations.
Awesome.
And yeah, that's all I had.
All right, so we do still have some more questions. So I'm gonna leave this up and I'll take over when we'll start talking through them. But Guy, the first one, do you want to talk a little bit about Mac OS in general with sync? There's some question, or just a generic question about being able to select folders and sync them to OneDrive. Do you want to give a high level on what's available within Mac OS, and as you're kind of looking at the sync ideal state, what people should be thinking about or planning for, and any of the specific capabilities to call out that that Mac OS has?
Yeah, totally. So Mac OS, as I mentioned, you can install it with Office or you can install our standalone client. There are two flavors of the sync client on Mac OS. There's the standalone one, and then there's the one from the App Store. Our recommendation in general within our organization is to go with the standalone one because it's just easier to manage and to configure. But in terms of the ideal state, the same updates and rings, basically, the same rings apply on Mac OS. So we recommend the same, being in production with some users and insiders and having those URLs unblocked. Windows notification service, despite the name, is the same mechanism we also use to know about changes in the service or in the cloud on Mac OS. So that's super important as well. Files on demand is a feature that we shipped initially on Windows because it was a feature that required such deep integration within the operating system. So we worked really closely with the Windows team. And then last year we brought it to Mac OS, and now it's fully enabled by default if you have the right version of Mac OS. And then Office integration is another one that is also available on Mac OS. And so all of the rich collaboration features and like co-authoring and autosave, et cetera, are also available for Office on the Mac. Silent account configuration is something we don't have quite in the same way yet. But I'll go back to my roadmap slide. The thing that's rolling out right now soon is basically onboarding to this new authentication library, which allows us to do Office SSO, so single sign-on with Office. And so if the user is signed in with Office on Mac OS, then we will also be able to pick up those credentials. And so it'll help. It's not exactly the same. We also do that on Windows, but it's not exactly the same as silent account configuration. But that should really help with making sure that users are logged in on Mac OS. And then Known Folder Move is not one that we have yet on Mac. It's something we're thinking about, but we don't have any. It's just something the team is thinking about. But it's a little bit different on Mac OS, and there's not the same functionality to really redirect those known folders, and so that's not available yet. In general, we try to bring features at the same time, but in certain cases when they're very tied to the OS, that's when you might see a difference, or like with files on demand, it came first on Windows and then on Mac.
Great. And what about, we talked about the 3 folders that are available today. What about for the people that are kind of asking about other folders or functionality? Do you want to kind of speak to what you've seen and why those 3 folders?
Yeah, totally. So we started with those 3 folders for a few reasons. One, we kind of aligned between personal and the business product. And so with personal, we thought those folders made most sense, and we didn't necessarily want to be uploading a bunch of movies or music automatically just because of the, the storage quota. We also think of those folders as like the main collaboration and productivity folders. And so we thought those made a lot of sense. I do hear a lot of questions about other folders like videos and music in the enterprise side. It's something, we're continuing to listen to feedback. The biggest feedback in the past year was OneNote, cross-volume reporting, and then basically ignoring certain file types. And so that's kind of what the team has been focused on. But now we're at a point, especially with having completed the OneNote migration and cross-volume, where we're starting to think about what's next for KFM. And so the team will be looking at kind of all the different feedback we're hearing and seeing which thing it makes sense to tackle next. But we don't currently have any plans to expand beyond those folders.
Great. The last one, I'll actually kind of take this and you can stop sharing, Gaia, and I'll take over here.
Sure.
The last question we had out there, and I'll take it, how does it relate to SharePoint Online libraries? So when you're syncing files through OneDrive, OneDrive allows you to sync, the OneDrive Sync client allows you to sync both your OneDrive, which is your personal files, and also the SharePoint files that live inside of a SharePoint library. So the OneDrive client lets you do that. How does KFM relate to it? KFM will only sync files to your personal OneDrive if you enable it, because your files are specific on your device, would be part of your OneDrive and not necessarily part of a shared SharePoint Online environment. So you would have that available to only to your personal device on your personal OneDrive. All right, and then, so the last question, Vlad, I'm gonna as I kind of wrap this up, do you wanna kind of talk about availability for slides and presentation?
Yes, so the recording, everything has been recorded, as well as the slides will be emailed to everybody who registered within the next 24 to 36 hours, depending on how many meetings I have this afternoon, to be honest. I'll try to get it to everybody as soon as possible. So watch your email in the next day or two.
And we will have, we'll make sure that the slides and the recording are available with that, because there's a lot of really good content here from Gaia as well. And kind of the last one, we do have another webinar coming up in this series where we will be jumping a little bit more into security compliance. So make sure you sign up and register for this one. We are going to be diving fully into sensitivity labels for SharePoint sites, Microsoft Teams, Office 365 groups, and actually the Office files behind it. So some really great new functionality that is rolling out almost as we speak for sensitivity labels kind of across your environment. So a good example is if you enable KFM and you also are looking at trying to secure your content using modern classification and sensitivity labels, enabling KFM and combining that with sensitivity for Office files, you are in a really good state for kind of ensuring security for your files as well. But with that, obviously, thanks Vlad for helping us, for going through all of this, and Gaia, of course, thank you very much for the time today.
Yeah, it was my pleasure. Had a lot of fun.
Thank you, everyone, and have a great rest of the week. I know a lot of you have a long weekend, so enjoy the long weekend and stay safe. And like Bruce said, Gaia, thank you very much for your time. I really appreciated the time that you give to the community.
Awesome. Thanks again.
Bye-bye, everyone.